I see that many souls are dying and I cannot help them, because they do not want to receive the graces of my mercy. Diary of St. Faustina, 639. Have you ever felt that something inside you was quietly fading, even though everything outside looked the same? Have you ever sensed that spiritual decline happens long before anyone notices it? And have you ever wondered if the signs of a dying soul are not dramatic or loud, but subtle enough to be mistaken for ordinary life? In the dim blue silence of dawn, as the first threads of light entered her convent cell, St. Faustina was shown a truth so piercing that it followed her for the rest of her life. A soul does not die suddenly. It dies gradually, quietly, layer by layer, until the person no longer feels the absence of God. Before we continue, subscribe if you want to understand the real spiritual teachings Jesus entrusted to St. Faustina, teachings meant not to frighten, but to awaken. Faustina often wrote how Jesus allowed her to see the state of souls, not through visions of fire or terror, but through a spiritual sensitivity he himself cultivated in her. One morning, while she prayed in the chapel, she felt an unexpected heaviness in her heart. Not her own sorrow, but a sorrow given to her. A sorrow Jesus wanted her to understand. The chapel was almost empty. The candles flickered unevenly. The air held the stillness that exists only when heaven wishes to speak. Faustina knelt on the wooden floor, her hands trembling as she sensed Jesus draw near with a seriousness she rarely felt. And then, softly, he revealed to her that many souls, many who once walked close to God, had begun to die spiritually without noticing it. The first thing he showed her was the silence inside such souls, not the silence of peace, but the silence of distance. A soul that is dying does not cry out. It stops speaking, it stops listening, it stops responding to grace. And that lack of response is the beginning of its death. Faustina felt the pain of this like a weight placed gently on her heart. She understood that spiritual death is not always marked by obvious sin, but by the slow withdrawal of the soul from God. A fading desire to pray, a quiet neglect of small acts of love, a reluctance to look honestly into one's conscience. Jesus helped her see that these small movements of the heart, when ignored, become the first signs of a deep spiritual sickness. She pressed her forehead against the edge of the pew, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. Jesus allowed her to perceive how the soul's life, once vibrant, becomes thin like a candle burning out, not blown out violently, but suffocating slowly for lack of oxygen. This spiritual suffocation, he told her, is the tragedy of souls who refuse grace. Faustina remained still, letting the truth settle inside her. The signs were subtle, almost ordinary, and that is why so few noticed them. Faustina remained in the chapel long after the morning light had settled across the wooden floor. The silence around her had a weight to it, as if the walls themselves were listening. Her heart felt pierced, yet strangely calm, because Jesus was not revealing these things to frighten her. He was revealing them, so she could understand how to pray for souls who did not know they were slipping away from him. As she continued to kneel, Jesus gently led her to the second sign of spiritual death, the loss of sensitivity to sin. She understood this not through images, but through a sudden knowing that settled into her soul like ink spreading through water. At first, the devout soul feels sorrow for even small faults, but when the spiritual life begins to wither, that sorrow becomes faint. The conscience grows quiet, not at peace, but numb. The heart stops reacting. Small sins no longer trouble it. Larger ones no longer shock it. And eventually the soul begins calling darkness light, and light darkness. This numbness, Jesus showed her, is one of the most dangerous signs, because the person rarely sees it happening. Faustina remembered a moment from her earlier years when she herself felt this fading sensitivity. She had neglected a small act of charity, something insignificant to others, but important to God, and at first she felt only a passing discomfort. But later in prayer, Jesus showed her that the real danger was not the fault itself, but her indifference to it. That quiet indifference, so small, so ordinary, held the potential to grow into coldness, and from coldness into detachment, and from detachment into spiritual sleep. As she reflected on this, Jesus allowed her to sense the state of a soul caught in that numbness. and the feeling shook her deeply. It was not rebellion, it was not hatred of God. It was emptiness, a quiet drifting, like a boat losing its anchor. A soul that no longer recognizes sin has already begun to die, not because God abandons it, but because it walks away from the light that reveals what needs healing. She placed her hand over her heart, as if trying to shield it from the sorrow she felt. She knew that the enemy loves this second sign, because a hardened conscience is easier to guide than a vigilant one, and he rarely hardens it through great temptations. Instead, he uses distractions, tiredness, routine, small compromises. The soul slowly becomes blind, not by one great act, but by 1,000 unnoticed moments. When Faustina finally lifted her head, the chapel was filled with the warm gold of late-morning sunlight. Yet she felt a shadow pass through her heart, not a darkness from Jesus, but the sorrow he allowed her to feel for those who lived in this numbness. She whispered a prayer for every soul who no longer felt the weight of sin, asking Jesus to awaken them gently before the numbness turned into silence and the silence into death. The signs were becoming clearer now, but she sensed there were more. As the day continued, Faustina carried the weight of Jesus' revelations like a quiet flame burning in her chest. She moved through her duties, the kitchen, the corridors, the laundry room, with outward calm, but inside her soul was listening. Every sound, every silence seemed charged with meaning, as though heaven wished to continue speaking through the ordinary rhythm of her day. And before long, Jesus drew her into the third sign of a soul dying spiritually, the gradual loss of desire for prayer. This sign, he made her understand, is often mistaken for fatigue or distraction. At first, the soul still prays, but only with its lips. The heart begins to drift. Prayer becomes routine, then duty, and finally, burden. Soon the soul finds every excuse to shorten prayer, delay prayer, or replace prayer with activity. Not because it is evil, but because the interior connection with God is thinning, like a thread stretched too far. Faustina remembered vividly a moment when she felt this weakening herself. She had entered the chapel one afternoon, exhausted from work, and as she knelt, she felt nothing. No warmth, no desire, only dryness. At first, she thought it was simply physical fatigue, but as she remained silent before the tabernacle, Jesus gently showed her that dryness alone is not the danger, disinterest is. A soul in spiritual decline begins to avoid the silence where God speaks. It chooses noise instead. It chooses distraction. It chooses motion. The silence becomes uncomfortable because it reveals the soul's emptiness. Faustina trembled at this understanding. She knew that Jesus does not abandon the soul in dryness. On the contrary, he often draws nearer. But a dying soul does not seek him. It flees from the very place where life can be restored. The absence of prayer is not the cause of death. It is the symptom that the soul has stopped breathing. In her heart, Jesus revealed the deeper tragedy hidden in this third sign. A soul that stops praying soon forgets that prayer is not a duty, but a lifeline. Every moment without prayer widens the distance, not because God withdraws, but because the soul no longer turns toward him. It becomes like a plant that still stands tall but has stopped receiving water. For a while it appears alive, its leaves remain green, but inside the roots begin to dry, and by the time the leaves fade, the damage is already deep. Faustina pressed her fingers lightly to the pew, her eyes stinging with quiet tears. She saw how many souls walked toward this spiritual decline silently, faithful people, good people, who one day simply stopped speaking to God, not out of rejection, but out of slow exhaustion. The enemy needs nothing more than this. He does not need rebellion, only forgetfulness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the chapel floor, and Faustina whispered a prayer for those who had forgotten how to pray, not accusing them, but pleading for them. She asked Jesus to awaken longing where numbness had taken root, to restore desire where silence had grown heavy, to breathe life into souls losing the strength to breathe spiritually. The signs were becoming sharper in her heart, and she sensed that the fourth sign would be even more painful to witness. As evening settled over the convent, the long shadows stretched across the hallways like gentle reminders that the day was drawing to its close. Faustina moved quietly through her final duties, but her heart was still absorbed by the truths Jesus had been revealing. The signs of a soul's decline were unfolding one by one, each more delicate and more painful than the last. And as the last echoes of footsteps faded into silence, Jesus led her into the fourth sign, a sign he had allowed her to feel many times, a sign that wounded his heart deeply, the withdrawal of love. She understood this not through words but through a sudden ache, sharp, tender, unmistakable, pressing on her chest. It was the feeling of love being replaced with indifference, not hatred, not rebellion, simply indifference, a cooling of affection for God, for others, and even for the soul's own salvation. This indifference, Jesus showed her, is one of the clearest signs that a soul is beginning to die spiritually. Faustina remembered the early days of her vocation, when every act of charity felt like a flame inside her, when her heart moved quickly toward love, toward forgiveness, toward compassion. But she also remembered moments when she felt that warmth dimming, moments when love felt heavy instead of joyful. In prayer, Jesus had revealed to her that love does not disappear in a moment. It fades when the soul stops protecting it. It fades when the heart grows tired of giving. It fades when resentment is not confessed, when judgment is not humbled, when small opportunities to love are ignored. This slow fading, Jesus told her, is the enemy's quiet triumph. Because once love weakens, everything weakens. Acts of service become duty, kindness becomes forced, patience becomes thin. The soul begins to retreat inward, no longer moved by compassion, no longer sensitive to the needs of others. And when love withdraws, the soul's connection to God loosens like a rope slipping through tired hands. Faustina felt the weight of this revelation deeply. She knew that God is love, not as a concept, but as a living reality. And when love fades from the heart, it is not simply a moral issue. It is a spiritual tragedy. The soul is losing its likeness to God. It becomes dim, like a lantern with low oil, flickering weakly before the flame finally dies out. She knelt before the crucifix in the quiet corridor, letting the dim light from a nearby lamp settle across her face. She closed her eyes and prayed, asking Jesus why love fades so easily, even in devout souls. The answer came softly, like a whisper carried on the breath of the night. Love fades when the soul stops receiving it. A heart that no longer drinks from the fountain of God's mercy cannot pour out what it no longer contains. In that moment, Faustina understood that the withdrawal of love is not the result of cruelty or malice. Most souls do not intend to stop loving. It happens because the heart becomes tired, wounded, distracted, or numb. And when the soul no longer draws from God, it slowly stops giving him to others. She pressed her hand against the crucifix and let a single tear fall, praying for every soul whose love had grown cold, not condemning them, but pleading for their flame to be rekindled by the breath of divine mercy. She sensed now that the fifth and final sign would reveal the deepest danger of all. Night had fully descended upon the convent, draping everything in a gentle stillness. The hallways were quiet, the wooden floors cool beneath Faustina's steps, and the soft echo of distant wind brushed against the old windows. Her heart felt heavy, yet illuminated, as if Jesus himself were guiding her deeper into a truth few dare to look at. The fifth sign, the most painful, the most hidden, the one few souls ever recognize until it is almost too late, was beginning to unfold within her soul. This final sign, Jesus showed her, is the loss of trust in God. It does not begin with rebellion. It does not begin with stormy defiance. It begins quietly, subtly, with small doubts that gather like thin clouds over the heart. A soul that once trusted easily begins to question whether God hears it, whether he understands it, whether he truly forgives it. These doubts do not shout, they whisper, and as they whisper, they drain the soul of confidence, of courage, of the certainty that God is merciful. Faustina knew this truth deeply. She had faced moments in her own journey when trust felt fragile, moments when suffering pressed against her so strongly that she feared she might break. But Jesus always drew her back, reminding her that trust is the lifeline of the soul. Without it, grace cannot work. Without it, mercy cannot flow. Without it, prayer becomes empty words spoken into a void. Jesus allowed her to feel, for a brief moment, the interior state of a soul losing trust. The sensation shook her. It felt like standing in the cold with no shelter, like reaching out for someone in the dark and finding no hand to grasp. The soul was not angry. It was weary. Weary from carrying burdens alone. Weary from not seeing immediate answers to prayer. Weary from believing it had disappointed God beyond repair. This weariness, Jesus revealed, is the enemy's final triumph. For once trust dies, the soul no longer receives mercy. Not because God withdraws it, he never does, but because the soul stops opening itself to receive it. A dying soul no longer dares to say, "Jesus, I trust in you," because it feels unworthy of trust itself. Faustina placed her forehead against the wooden pew, tears slipping silently onto the floor. She felt the agony of Jesus for such souls, the souls who walk through life carrying a weight they were never meant to carry, souls who believe God tolerates them rather than loves them, souls who step back from him not out of defiance, but out of fear. And yet, Jesus whispered into her heart with tender firmness, any soul, even the one closest to spiritual death, can be restored in a single moment of trust, one sincere act of turning back, one breath of humility, one quiet whisper, "Jesus, have mercy on me." That single movement opens the floodgates of heaven. Faustina rose from prayer slowly, her heart trembling with understanding. Of all the signs of spiritual death, the loss of trust is the most dangerous and the easiest to hide. It does not scream, it sighs, and few notice its presence until the soul is near collapse. But even then, Jesus waits. The convent lay in complete silence now, the kind of silence that seems to pulse gently through the air, wrapping every space in a soft stillness. Faustina stood for a long moment near the chapel door, her hand resting on the cool brass handle, absorbing the weight of everything Jesus had shown her. The 5 signs were not abstract theories. They were real afflictions of real souls, souls Jesus loved, souls he suffered for, souls he wanted to bring back to life. Her heart trembled at the thought that most people never notice these signs until the soul has already drifted far from grace. She stepped inside the chapel once more, drawn not by duty but by a deep ache to be near the one who had entrusted her with so much. The sanctuary lamp flickered quietly, casting a warm glow across the tabernacle. Faustina knelt slowly, letting her knees sink into the familiar wood, and lifted her eyes toward the small flame that symbolized Jesus' eternal presence. In that flickering light, she understood the final message he wanted her to carry. Spiritual death is never inevitable. No matter how far the soul has wandered, whether it has grown numb to sin, abandoned prayer, allowed love to fade, or lost all trust, Jesus waits with an unchanging tenderness. He does not recoil from dying souls. He draws nearer. The tragedy, Faustina realized, is not that souls die spiritually. The tragedy is that they do not know how easily they can come back to life. Jesus impressed this truth upon her heart with a warmth that made her breath catch. One act of humility can resurrect a dying soul. One moment of sincerity, one whisper of longing, one tear shed in truth. The smallest movement toward God can break through layers of numbness, indifference, distraction, pride, and despair. She felt this mercy flow through her like a quiet fire. Jesus was not showing her the signs of death to terrify her or to condemn souls, but to awaken them, to call them gently back to the breath of life. He wanted her to see that the soul dies slowly, but it revives instantly when touched by grace. The danger is not in weakness, the danger is in silence. Faustina placed her hand over her heart and whispered, barely audible, "Jesus, I trust in you," knowing that this simple act was the lifeline of every soul. Trust opens the door to mercy. Mercy restores the soul, and once mercy enters, the signs of death begin to recede like darkness fading before dawn. As she rose from the chapel floor, she felt a peace deeper than anything she had known that day. The night was still, but her heart burned with a renewed purpose. She understood that she was not called to judge souls, but to pray for them, to intercede for them, to love them back to life with the same mercy Jesus poured into her. She walked back to her cell slowly, the hem of her habit brushing softly against the stone floor, her soul glowing with the certainty that even when spiritual death seems near, divine mercy is nearer still, and that no soul, no matter how faint its light, is ever beyond the reach of Christ's healing love.